The Strait of Hormuz is far more important than people realise. Most people know it as one of the world's most important oil routes, and that's true, but oil is only part of the story. It's the lifeline of the entire Gulf region. Through this narrow gateway flows the food that fills supermarket shelves, the water infrastructure that keeps cities running, the medicine hospitals depend on, and the construction materials building some of the fastest growing cities on earth. If that flow is disrupted, some of the wealthiest countries in the world could find themselves in a very difficult situation. And that's exactly why this tiny choke point could become Iran's biggest advantage in a war with the United States. Because controlling the Strait of Hormuz wouldn't just affect oil markets, it could destabilize the Gulf and shock the global economy, forcing the United States to back down. So in this video we're going to break down why this narrow stretch of water may be one of the most important strategic battlegrounds on this planet. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz is so important, you first have to look at the geography of the Persian Gulf. The Gulf is essentially a large enclosed body of water, and for most countries surrounding it, there is only one way in or out. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq and Bahrain all rely heavily on this narrow corridor to connect them to the global economy. The harsh climate and limited farmlands across much of the Gulf means a large share of the region's food has to be brought in from abroad. In some countries, as much as 80 to 90% of food is imported. In other words, this narrow corridor supplies many of the essentials that keep the modern Gulf economies functioning. At the same time, the ships moving in the opposite direction carry something just as important: oil and gas. A large share of the region's energy export pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. And those exports generate the majority of the revenue for these Gulf nations, but also keeps the global economy supplied with the energy it needs. So if the flow of ships through the Strait of Hormuz continues to be disrupted, consequences could be dire. What is critical right now is water. Much of the region's drinking water doesn't come from rivers or lakes. Instead, it comes from desalination plants that turn seawater into fresh water. But desalination doesn't run on seawater alone. The process requires specialized chemicals and other materials that are imported from abroad, and many of these supplies come through the Strait of Hormuz. If those shipments continue to be disrupted, maintaining desalination systems could quickly become more difficult. In other words, the Strait of Hormuz keeps the millions of people supplied with fresh drinking water, and it will soon run dry. The war has started, but Iran doesn't need to defeat the United States in this war. Instead, it only needs to disrupt the trade flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, because that alone will send shockwaves across the global economy. For example, oil and gas prices have risen dramatically since the start of the war, leading you to have to pay more for your energy bills. Companies across the globe rely on this energy to manufacture the products you buy. Economies begin to feel the shock, and pressure builds on governments far beyond the battlefield as inflation rises globally. For the United States, if the global impact grows large enough, the pressure to retreat from the war begins to outweigh the desire to continue the war. And this is where Iran's strategy begins to make sense, because Iran hasn't built its military to defeat the United States in a traditional war. Instead, it has spent decades preparing for a very different kind of conflict, one designed to raise the cost of war for its opponents. By focusing on pressure points like the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's strategy isn't about winning quickly. It's about enduring long enough for the consequences to build. Over time, that pressure will begin to mount on Trump, because as the global impact of the conflict grows, the pressure to end the war would grow with it. At the same time, the countries surrounding the Persian Gulf will begin to feel the strain. These economies depend heavily on stability of the strait, and prolonged disruption would force governments to shift their priorities towards protecting their own economies, which would make sustaining a long war in the region increasingly difficult for the United States. And that's the core of Iran's strategy: not defeating the United States military, but creating enough economic and political pressure that continuing the war becomes harder than ending